On Friday, the 1st of September 1933, a student stood on a platform at Prague's Wilson station, waiting for the 9 o'clock night express to the far east of the country. He watched a stocky man in light clothes heave a suitcase onto the rack of a third-class compartment and walk away without it. An hour later, at Masaryk station across the city, a postal clerk saw a man of about 40 in a soft hat leave a brown suitcase by the turnstiles, come back for it, and carry it onto the 10 o'clock train to Bratislava. By Saturday morning, both suitcases had been opened. The brown one at Bratislava held a woman's head and legs wrapped in bedding. At Košice, the last two carriages of the express had been uncoupled by chance, and a railwayman found the second case in one of them. Together, they weighed more than 70 kilos. Nobody in either city knew whose body it was. 2 men, 2 stations, 2 trains, 1 woman. Prague would spend 90 years trying to put the 2 suitcases back together. And to answer the question, the Slovak railwayman asked first, who was she, and who had done this to her? Cases like this one sat in a museum's cartons for 90 years before anyone read them properly. If they deserve to be told, subscribe. And when you have heard the whole story, say in the comments who you think carried those suitcases. The remains were brought to Prague, washed and photographed. And on the Monday, the police did something the city had never seen. In the shop window of police headquarters at number 4, Bartolomejska Street, the building every Prague policeman called the 4, they put the photograph of the dead woman's face, the 2 suitcases, and the underwear that had been packed in with her, and they asked the city who she was. The papers printed the photograph on their front pages. Crowds stood in Bartolomejska Street all day. Within a week, about 700 letters had come in, and after that, they came by the dozen every day. 3 mothers said the face was their daughter's. A woman from Olomouc named her daughter Jarmila, who was alive. A mother from Slatiniani wept over the window and said the dead girl was her Marie, 21 years old, and detectives took her by train to Pardubice, where they found Marie alive, feeding chickens, and the mother wept again. A third girl from Olomouc was recognized by her mother, by a friend, and by her own fiancé, and she was alive too. On Wednesday evening, the 6th of September, 2 young women from a mining town in Slovakia came to the fore and said a name. On Thursday morning, the photograph came out of the window. The name was Otýlie Vranská. She was 22, from Brezno, on the Hron River in central Slovakia, and she had been in Prague for 6 months. Her sisters recognized her, but it was the police who put the name on the file, and they did it with their own hands. 4 years earlier, in October 1929, she had been detained in the Slovak town of Kisucké Nové Mesto for vagrancy and prostitution, and fingerprinted. The prints matched the dead woman's fingers. That record, and the word in it, would follow her through everything that came after. Otýlie Vranská was born in March 1911 in Brezno, where her father, a railwayman by trade, later worked for the town in his retirement, and where her mother raised 3 daughters and a son on very little. Otýlie ran away from home at 11. The authorities put her in a reform school at Jičín in Bohemia for 2 years. The one thing everyone later agreed she took from it was the language. She came out speaking Czech without a trace of Slovak, and she spoke Hungarian as well, which mattered in the towns along the Hron. She went into service in Žilina. In Žilina, she had a soldier sweetheart. who would later come to Prague looking for her in the days after she died and before anyone knew her name. She arrived in Prague on the 1st of March 1933, in the worst year the young republic had known. Czechoslovakia, between the wars, was the most industrial country in Central Europe, and the depression had reached it late and hard. That year, 750,000 people were out of work. Families lived in shanty colonies on the edges of the city, and a servant girl from Slovakia had to take what she could find. 2 of her sisters were already in Prague. One was married and lived in Balbejnova Street in Vinohrady, and Otýlie slept there the first weeks. The other was in service in Klemenska Street. She found a place in a lady's household in Revoluční Street and kept it 2.5 months. Then 6 weeks of nothing. Then, from July, a job as a maid at a restaurant in Vinohrady, u Kadezhabka, where she worked beside a woman 3 years older, Božena Velingajrova, whom the police would later describe as the decisive influence on her. On the 7th and 8th of August, the 2 of them quit. They took a room together at number 12, Velehradska Street, in the flat of an older landlady, and by the end of the month they owed her the rent. What Otýlie did with her nights is the question the whole case has turned on, and the 1933 police answered it in the worst way available to them. The other girls of the night city called her Slovachka, the Slovak girl, and behind her back a village calf, their phrase for a naive country girl who did not know the trade. One witness told the police he had paid her 20 crowns once, at a time when a pair of batya shoes cost 19.90. The papers called her a prostitute from the first week, and the record from Kisucké Nové Mesto sat in the file to confirm it. The police museum, which reopened the file decades later, read the same pages and came to a different finding. A maid between jobs and a night girl who liked to dance and be bought a drink with no trade at all. Her own landlady, who saw her every day, never called her anything else. On Thursday, the 31st of August, her landlady cooked plum dumplings at midday and gave her a warning with them. The landlady told her, "If you mean to come home after midnight, do not come home at all." Otýlie told her landlady where she was going. She was meeting a sergeant, she said, who had promised to marry her and to get her a job in the army laundry. She put on a dark green dress. At 8 that evening, she was in the Koruna passage at the foot of Wenceslas Square with Velingajrova, and a street photographer took the last picture of her alive, laughing among acquaintances. The sergeant arrived in uniform, and he was not alone. On his arm was a Slovak woman Otýlie knew from Žilina, Antonia Koklesova, a woman of the streets with 2 years of schooling, who signed her name Antony. There was a quarrel, Velingajrova said later, and then the 3 of them went to a tavern in Stjepanska Street, u Kupcu, and stayed until 11. Between them they had 4 half-liters of beer, a Pishinger cake, and a pretzel. Otýlie sang. She did her makeup at the table. She said she would go and wait at the Rococo bar for the head waiter, who let her sleep at his place. Koklesova offered her a bed in her own flat, and Otýlie refused it. At midnight, the 3 of them stood by the dairy kiosk on Karlovo Náměstí and parted. The sergeant and Koklesova went to his flat in Mikla, in the south of the city. Otýlie walked to a tavern in Kšementsova Street, whose name translates as "at the political corpse," u Politické mrtvohly, where a Slovak band led by a man called Chonka played, and she could talk Hungarian with him. A tall, curly-haired blonde man who came there on weekdays always with a different girl and who had already taken her there twice, bought her a glass of muscat wine. After midnight, she wanted fruit, and he sent the food runner for an apple and lent her his knife. She ate half of it and left the rest on the plate. Sometime after 1 in the morning, a witness saw her on the corner of Melantrikova Street, looking in through the door of the dance hall at U Schmelhausu. The witness said, as if she was searching for someone. The blonde was not with her. Nothing after that. She would never come back to Velehradska Street, and her landlady never saw the rent. The suitcases were the first thing the police had, and for years they were the best. The case found at Košice was pigskin, 70 by 40 by 22 centimetres, hand-stitched, worth about 130 crowns, with 2 brass locks. The case found at Bratislava was cheaper, dark brown vulcanized fibre, a little smaller, with 2 nickel locks. Both had the same English patent locks, a design registered in 1930. Both had been repaired, badly, more than once. Inside were newspapers of several different dates, a man's underwear, a woman's slip, a sponge, and a magazine called Prot, with 2 marriage advertisements placed by women, both of whom the police traced, both alive. The bedding was the clue everyone remembered. One sheet was embroidered with a K, underlined 3 times, and another with K, and the figure 1. The police read it as a laundry mark and searched every laundry in Prague, and then, through the gendarmerie, every laundry in the Republic. One man walked into the fore with his own underpants because they had a K on them. Nothing came of the K. Nobody took fingerprints from the suitcases. The police did something else with them. On the Monday morning, they put the cases and the bedding on public show at headquarters, and thousands came to look. The body went to Professor František Hayek at the Institute of Forensic Medicine, the man who would later perform the autopsies the Republic could not forget. Among them, the foreign minister found dead under a window in 1948. The summary of his findings that reached the detectives and the papers said this: the woman had been struck with a meat cleaver, decapitated while still alive, and dismembered with a certain expertise. From that word, the whole investigation took its shape. The police went looking for a man who knew how to cut. Surgeons, medical students, butchers, a veterinarian who came under suspicion in the first week. Fibres of coconut matting were found on the body, and coconut matting meant a bathroom mat, and a bathroom in the Prague of 1933 meant a flat with running water and a landlord who could afford it. 2 things narrowed the night. The half-eaten apple at U Politické mrtvoli was in her stomach, barely digested, and the professor put her death between 1 and 3 in the morning. And the whole of her, the drained and washed body, the head, the limbs, had been packed and carried across the city and lifted onto 2 trains before 10 the next evening. Whoever had done it had a flat, a bathroom, a cleaver, and most of a day. The city read those findings in its morning papers and began, by the hundreds, to write in with names. The investigation belonged to Josef Vanjasek, a police councillor with 30 years in the job, so well known in the city that a television series would later be built on him, and to a team of 5 detectives who carried every murder in Greater Prague that year. Under him, a young lawyer, Dr. Zdeněk Borkovec, newly promoted to commissioner, took the statements. The sergeant did not come to them. He had been in the Koruna passage in uniform at 8 o'clock on the last evening of her life, and the papers had been full of her for a week, and he did not come forward. They found him through a witness who knew him by sight and not by name. Detectives walked her from barracks to barracks across Prague, and at the Karlín barracks the units were paraded in front of her, and she picked him out of the ranks. On the morning of the 8th of September, the police had their man. The next day's Venkov gave his explanation. He had known the girl. He had not known she was dead, and he had not known he was wanted because, he said, he had so little time that he read the papers once a week. The man she picked out was Josef Piekny, a staff sergeant major in charge of stores and accounts at Karlín. He was 39, born in Mikla, a fitter by trade, and a decorated veteran of the Czechoslovak Legion, the Czech and Slovak prisoners of war, who had changed sides in Russia and fought their way across Siberia to come home. His army file, which the police museum would read 90 years later, told the rest. Taken prisoner in the Carpathians in April 1915, enrolled in the Legion in 1916, the first battle at Zborov, Bakhmach, Tarnopol, guard duty along the Trans-Siberian Railway, a machine gun company, and a spell as a scout. His annual evaluations were good. A man in his position, the museum's director likes to say, ran the barracks, because whoever ran the stores ran everything. He was divorced with a son, and he lived in Mikla in Taborska Street with his new companion, Antonia Koklesova. He admitted knowing Otýlie and paying her 20 crowns once. He denied the promise of marriage. He had offered her lodging, he said, some cleaning work, and a place in the laundry. On the 8th of September, Dr. Bokovets questioned him and Koklesova separately, and their accounts of what happened after the dairy kiosk on Karlovo Náměstí did not agree. One said they took the tram to Mikla, the other said they walked. The next day, the sergeant came back to Dr. Bokovets of his own accord and gave a second statement. It begins with the words, "I changed my original statement." The new version matched hers. He added something nobody had asked him. At 5:30 on the afternoon of the 1st of September, he said he had given notice to his landlord, a man named Dolezal, and from 8:30 that evening he had been out looking for new lodgings. Those were the hours in which two men carried 2 suitcases into 2 Prague stations. The alibi came from the woman who had shared his evening, and the headline in Venkov read, "The Sergeant's Alibi Given by a Friend of Vranska's." The police did not search the flat in Mikla. Nobody checked whether he moved out. The city by then was reading about someone else. On the 12th of September, the Prague afternoon paper Polední List printed a letter. Its writer signed himself the Phantom of the Street, and he said he had killed Otýlie Vranská. He had first written to the criminal police, on paper hatched with pencil lines, and when the police kept it quiet, he had written to the paper. The Phantom wrote, "I killed from a thirst for human blood, not for money. She was my third. First I drugged her, then I stunned her, and then I cut her up according to a picture of a skeleton." He wrote that he had put the parts into the suitcases and taken them to the station himself on a 2-wheeled cart, and that in Dielnitska Street an acquaintance had helped him push it and asked what he was carrying, and he had said old clothes. He wrote, "I went to look at the murdered woman's head at police headquarters." He wrote, "I can calmly prepare for my 4th. The letters kept coming, and the paper kept printing them. In the second, the Phantom explained himself, revenge on the women of the street for a lover called M, who had robbed him in 1921. He had served in the French Foreign Legion, he wrote, in Sidi Bel Abbes from 1925 to 1928, and deserted to Spain, and come home in 1929, and to prove it, he added a postscript in English. He wrote that he had bought the suitcases in Germany in 1930. The police announced that one of his letters carried a fingerprint, and that every registered prostitute in Prague would now be fingerprinted for her own protection. The Phantom wrote back that it was pointless. He always wore gloves, he said, and he would cut the fingers off his next victim and pour acid over her head. Some of the letters he delivered to the newsroom by hand. A psychologist consulted by the paper concluded that the writer certainly owned a writing desk. The city wrote too. Letters came in by the thousand, and among them ran the poison of the year Hitler had taken power across the border. It was a ritual murder, several of them said, 7 stabs and the throat. Every reader over 40 understood the reference. In 1899, a Jewish vagrant named Leopold Hilsner had been convicted of the murder of a girl at Polna. In a wave of ritual murder hysteria that the young Masaryk had risked his career to fight. One letter described a Dr. Stein who had gone pale on a tram. The police did not chase it, and the papers did not print it, and it sat in the file with the rest. The autumn had other suspects. A medium named Delphina Pop wrote to Councillor Van Jasek that she knew the killer and was sent away. A swindler named Glaser was picked up at Brezno on the Austrian border, with suitcase keys in his pocket and no suitcases, and 2 railwaymen identified him as the man at the station. He could prove that on the night of the 1st of September, he had been in Jihlava, a town more than 100 kilometers from Prague, and the railwaymen were wrong. For a few days at the end of September, the Moravian papers had the gendarmes closing a ring around a gang of degenerates who had used the girl and disposed of her. A Hungarian named Kish confessed to a different murder and was excluded. A suitcase repairer who had fitted those English locks was appealed to and never came forward. On the 2nd of November, a Prague paper sold an extra edition announcing the murderer's arrest, and there had been no arrest. In the middle of November, a man telephoned Dr. Borkovets at the 4 and said, in German, "But you will not get me." The Phantom, in his next letter, denied it had been him. The Phantom was never caught, and the police museum's team, reading his letters against the file 90 years later, saw what the 1933 detectives had half seen and never printed. Every detail in the letters had been in the newspapers first. The 2-wheeled cart came from a witness statement about a man and a woman pushing 2 suitcases through Strassmeyer Square. The skeleton picture answered the professor's word expertise. The English was bad, and the Foreign Legion taught its men French. He had looked at the head in the window like everyone else in Prague. The museum's finding is that the Phantom was a fraud who copied the papers, and that for 2 months of the only autumn the case could have been solved, he owned the front page. In October, the Austrian papers printed something else, that the Prague police had identified the murderer and were keeping him under observation, without naming him and without arresting him. They did not say who. There was another theory, and it had bodies behind it. On the 4th of February 1926, a woman called Anna Korchova, a widow from Žižkov, the street knew as Nanda the Gypsy, was found strangled with her own underwear on the drill ground at the Invalidovna in Karlin. A year later, on the 1st of February 1927, Ruzhena Petrova was found strangled with a belt on a rubbish dump beside the night shelter for the homeless in Vysočany, on the industrial edge of the city. On the 16th of July 1929, a dancer from the Babylon bar, Yana Yanotova, called Red Zhanda, got into a car on Shikopi with a man in a white coat and vanished. 2 mushroom pickers found her a fortnight later in the woods near Vshenory. laid out on a stretcher of birch branches. The papers added other names and counted that 5 of the 7 women were Slovaks and wrote of a yearly cycle. In December 1932, around Bratislava, a chambermaid named Anna Fibiova had been cut up and thrown from trains, and her head was found in April 1933. The Phantom claimed Janotova. The papers put Vranská at the end of the list and a Prague Ripper on the front page beside him. And in 1938, the list would grow by one name, Helena Kindlova, strangled in Tinska Street with an ammonia bottle left beside her to fake the cause. In October, a Prague detective took both suitcases to Lučenec, where Fibiova had worked in a hotel, and nobody there had seen them before. The police museum's answer to the Ripper, when it came, was about method. Those women were strangled where they stood and left where they fell, or carried a few meters into the trees. Nobody before Otýlie Vranská, and nobody after her, was drained and washed and packed and posted across a country by train. The suitcases were not a killer's signature, but a problem someone had solved once, in a hurry, and the file's own physics, the museum said, pointed at a flat, a bathroom, and a man who could carry 70 kilos to 2 stations in one evening. A camp of researchers has never accepted that answer, and still holds that a serial killer walked out of 1933 unpunished. The file itself answered them 90 years late. Otýlie Vranská was buried on the 15th of September 1933, early in the morning, in the common grave of the poor at the Olszany cemeteries, in a plain black coffin donated by a burial society for the destitute. Venkov reported that 3 people followed her to the grave, her mother and 2 sisters. The public had not been told, and there was nobody else in the cemetery. The grave was chosen, the paper added, so that she could be exhumed at any time if the case required it. It never did. The letters did not stop when the papers did. They came through the 30s, through the occupation, through the coup of 1948 and the years after it, and the police museum counts more than 5,000 of them in the file, the last dated 1966. In the 60s, a man who signed himself Comrade Dorda of the Tatra works in Smíchov denounced a famous surgeon, Professor Arnold Jirásek, a friend of President Masaryk, dead a year, as the killer who had confessed in his will. The police obtained a certified copy of the will. The professor had left his library to the nation, and there was not a word in it about Otýlie Vranská. Comrade Dorda, the file noted, was sleeping with a distant relative of the professor's. In 1951, Prague had the case again, or thought it did. A woman named Herta Černěnová was killed and cut up the same way. The head packed with the limbs, the torso apart, 7 stab wounds to the chest. Her suitcase was found at a weir on the Vltava. The new socialist police, under a chief criminal inspector named Miloslav Nečasek and a Prague chief named Kahlivoda, had the killer in days, a young man called Schmid. Nobody asked him why he had copied the murder of 1933. He had been 16 at the time. Kahlivoda then wrote an essay for the police journal explaining that the bourgeois police of the First Republic could never have solved the Vranská case, while a socialist team, working together, had solved Černěnová in 24 hours. In 1966, near the end of his career, he admitted in print that he would never crack it either. The case became the monument of Czechoslovak criminalistics, the one every policeman learned and none could close. In 1978, state television put it on the screen. The police series of the decade, 30 cases of Major Zaman, one for each year of the regime, gave its 15th episode the 1951 murder. On the desk of its fictional detective, it placed the real file, labelled Vražda Vranská, the murder of Vranská, so that he could read the older case while he solved the new one. The real file waited in a cabinet. The people who had read it were dead. The file reached the Police Museum of the Czech Republic from an old teaching collection of the criminal police, the Criminalistic Cabinet, which had inherited it in turn from the police museum the First Republic kept in Bartolomejska Street to train its detectives on real exhibits. The suitcases had been in a display case there since the 30s. The paper had followed them. A substantial part of the investigation, the protocols, the letters, the photographs, and, sealed in an envelope, hair. Some of it was Otýlie's own, cut from the head when the body was examined. Some of it was not. The 1933 detectives had taken unknown hairs from the dead woman's hand and forearm and put them in the file, and there they had stayed for 90 years. Radek Garlaš, the museum's director, and a team from the museum began reading the file in 2017, and they did what the 1933 police could not. They sent the hairs for DNA analysis to a specialist outside the Interior Ministry so that nobody could say the museum had produced its own result and had the work checked again in the United States. COVID put a year into the waiting. To compare the hairs with anyone, they needed living relatives of the people in the file, and they went looking for the descendants of the two people who had shared Otýlie's last evening, the sergeant and Antonia Koklesova. The sergeant's daughter, when they found her, said no. She did not know her father had been divorced before her mother, and she did not know he had a son from that marriage. The museum found the son in the registers. She declined to give a sample, and then, as Garlaš tells it, the refusal stopped mattering because the laboratory reported that the hairs from the dead woman's hand had come from a woman. Koklesova's son was alive, the last carrier of his mother's line, and Garlaš went to see him. Garlaš tells the story himself. "We need to talk to you," he said, and the man asked why. And Garlaš said, "Well, we think your grandmother murdered Otýlie Vranská." And the man looked at them and said, "Then we had better do this over coffee." He made the coffee. They told him everything they thought had happened in Mikla in 1933. And then the door opened. Garlaš says, and the man's daughter, about 22, walked in, looked at the visitors and asked, "Are you selling pots? Or are you Jehovah's Witnesses?" "Neither," they said. "We think your great-grandmother murdered Otýlie Vranská." The son gave his sample. No match. The hair in Otýlie's hand was not Antonia Koklesova's, and it was not her own. And after 90 years in an envelope, the museum could not rule out that it had come from a policeman's wife, or a laundress, or nobody who mattered at all. The one physical trace in the file led nowhere. What the file had instead was paper, and one sheet of it had never been read. The autopsy summary of 1933, the page the detectives and the papers had worked from, was a summary. The original protocol, written by Professor Hayek and his assistant Dr. Vulk in the week the body arrived, had never left the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Studničkova Street, and in the file there was only the digest of it. The museum's team went to the Institute and found the original, and it said something the summary had not. She had died of a single deep cut to the throat, made from behind with her head pulled back, a cut the protocol's readers at the museum could only call almost military. The blows to the head, the ones the summary had attributed to a meat cleaver, had landed on a body already lying down and already dying. The tissue around them showed almost no reaction. The weapon that fitted the wounds was a heavy blade with weight behind it, a saber, for instance, of the kind a sergeant of the period carried. The 7 stabs to the chest, the wounds that had made the Ripper theory, were shallow, and they had gone into a corpse. The head had been sawn off, crudely, with great force, through the bone of the neck. The hips had been separated the way any housewife who butchered her own meat could manage, and every joint told the same story. Strength, not skill. The body had been drained of blood and washed. On the jaw was a bruise the size of a 5-crown coin that nobody explained. The word expertise, the word that had sent the Prague police after surgeons and butchers and a veterinarian for the whole of the autumn of 1933, was not in the protocol. Neither was a woman's hand. Whoever sawed through that neck had been strong. What the protocol described was a killing done fast, from behind, by someone used to a blade, in a flat with a bathroom, and then a long, unskilled, exhausting job of making a woman fit into 2 suitcases. The one man in the file who had a saber, a bathroom, and no alibi for the loading hours had given his statement to Dr. Borkovets on the 8th of September and corrected it on the 9th. The museum went back to the sergeant's alibi with the protocol in hand. He had said that on the evening of the 1st of September, he was out looking for new lodgings from 8:30 because he had given notice that afternoon. The police registration slips of the city and the personnel file of the army both record where Josef Piekny lived, at Taborska Street in Mikla from 1931 until 1934. He did not move out that autumn. He moved 4 years later, married again in 1935, had a child, and left Prague with his family in 1939. The hours he had accounted for with a flat hunt were the hours the suitcases went into the trains, and the museum's director says it plainly. He lied, and he lied in the one direction that would keep him away from 2 railway stations. The team walked his routes. From Karlovo na Městě to the flat in Mikle took about 45 minutes by the night tram, an hour on foot in either direction, and the flat had a bathroom. The house itself was gone. The whole block was demolished for a bridge and a tram line, and no plans of it survive. They read the sergeant's evaluations and his file. A machine gunner and a scout in Russia, and a scout, Garlash believes, learns to take a sentry from behind with a blade across the throat. They read the witnesses again. One had told the police the sergeant forbade Otýlie to see people her own age and was capable of hitting her when they quarreled. They read Koklesova's statements and his. The contradiction, the correction, the alibi she gave him. And they read the 2 station witnesses, who had described 2 different men, neither of them him. The museum's answer to that is a theory it labels as one, that the cases were carried by subordinates from the stores, sent with a 2-crown tip, soldiers from the far east of the Republic who did not read Prague newspapers and never learned what they had carried. On the 21st of September 2023, 90 years to the month, Garlash presented the chain in the museum's lecture hall, beside the 2 suitcases. Why 90 and not 89, he was asked. And he said, 89. What kind of number is that? Then he gave the museum's conclusion, with its number attached. With about 80% certainty, the team said, the killer of Otýlie Vranská was Staff Sergeant Major Josef Piekny, very probably with Antonia Koklesova present, in the flat in Mikla, in the early hours of the 1st of September 1933. The evidence was indirect, Garlash said, a chain of it, but a jury court of the day would have tried him on it. The city had hunted a surgeon. The wound was a soldier's. 20% is the honest remainder, and the museum names it. A woman's hair in the dead woman's hand that belongs to nobody in the file. A tall, curly-haired blonde who bought her an apple after midnight and was never identified, though the detective's shorthand notes, still being deciphered, mention a gold tooth. 2 witnesses who saw 2 different men carry 2 suitcases, and a theory, not a proof, about who those men were. The sergeant was never charged with anything. He died out in the country, and his daughter did not want the question asked. Antonie Koklesova married a tinsmith in 1935. The museum's team followed her through the files that came after. In the last months before the occupation, on Wenceslas Square, she is recorded beating a Sudeten German over the head with her umbrella, one of the men in the white socks the nationalists wore as a badge. When the Germans took the rest of the country, he remembered her and denounced her, and she spent weeks in Gestapo custody before they let her go. In the 50s, she served several years in prison for distributing anti-communist leaflets. Her son was not sure she could read them. Garlash put it his own way. The museum's 2 chief suspects, he said, were veterans of the First, the Second, and the Third National Resistance. In Brezno, the Vranská family went on without her. The parish registers, read by the journalist who followed the museum's work, record that her sister Zuzana, 5 years younger, was shot dead on the 28th of June 1937 by her lover, whose parents had refused him a marriage to a poor girl, and that he then shot himself. Her father died in January 1944. Her brother Jan fell in the Slovak national uprising against the Germans that autumn, and a street in Brezno carries his name. Her mother died in November 1947, having buried 3 of her children, one of them in a pauper's grave in Prague that she had stood beside with 2 of her daughters on a September morning in 1933, when nobody else came. If you would like more cases like this one, cases the files kept for decades before anyone read them through, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because these stories are long. And say in the comments what you make of the museum's 80%, the sergeant with a sabre and a corrected alibi, or the ripper who wrote letters and was never found. Which of them carried the suitcases to the trains?